And there also was a feeling at the time, oh, these poor journalists, how are they going to learn to be business people? This is a detriment that they have to overcome this. And there's a great book by a journalist named David Epstein called Range. And he talks about how people are very successful in complex or experimental fields if they have done many different things. And I've actually come to believe that journalists are incredibly well equipped to create experimental new businesses because they will go out and find the information. They don't assume they know everything. They assume they don't. They'll go seek help, figure it out, put it together. If it doesn't work, okay, it's like on to the next story. The combination of skills for those who choose to take an entrepreneurial path, it fits pretty well.
Welcome to the Local News Matters podcast, where we explore pathways to stronger journalism, better businesses, and healthier communities. I'm Tim Regan-Porter, CEO of the Colorado Press Association. This episode is another in an occasional series of exit interviews, this time with Sue Cross, who retired in January from her post as Executive Director of the Institute for Nonprofit News, or INN. At INN, Sue has played a leading role in shaping the trajectory of nonprofit news in the United States. We delve into her contributions to the sector, her strategic approaches to sustaining journalism, and her transition from the Associated Press to leading INN's expansive growth. Under her guidance, INN expanded to support thousands of journalists across nearly 500 news organizations, significantly influencing the landscape of nonprofit news and local news in general. Sue's perspective sheds light on the unique challenges and innovations within the nonprofit sector. We discuss what those interested in starting a nonprofit or in converting a for-profit to a nonprofit should consider. We also explore broader trends affecting local news and how nonprofit models are uniquely positioned to address some of those challenges. Listeners will gain an understanding of the importance of community relationships in journalism, the role of innovation at the grassroots level, and the potential of nonprofit models to revitalize local news ecosystems. If you like this episode and what we're doing more generally, please follow in your favorite podcast app, leave us a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts, and tell your friends about us. This is a side project and a labor of love, and your support means a lot. You can find past episodes, full transcripts, and relevant links, and sign up for our newsletter at localnewsmatterspodcast.com, or for lazy typists like me at lnmpod.com. You can also follow us on most social media channels at lnmpod. And now I bring you Sue Cross. All right. Well, welcome, Sue. Glad to have you on the podcast.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah. So when was your last day at INN?
January 5th. So I just came into the beginning, and then Karen Rundlet started the following Monday. But we had kind of a month of planning, so it was a good handover.
And you've been there nearly 10 years, correct?
Yeah, 8 years, just a little over 8 years, which I think in my journalism career is the longest time I've done the same thing, which was actually kind of interesting to realize.
Yeah. So I think you started in 2015, right?
That's right. I started in late 2015, and there were about 100 nonprofit newsrooms in the country at that point. And it had been growing for a few years, but was still very nascent.
How many members did you have when you left?
It was somewhere between 450 and 500. And I think now it's just about hitting that 500 point.
Yeah, quite a growth trajectory there. And that's, it's not just that your membership grew. The number of nonprofit newsrooms in the U.S. has grown considerably.
Yeah, the numbers of newsrooms and also just the numbers of journalists. While as startups, they start small. The thing that so struck me by this year is that there are at least 4,000 journalists out there working out of nonprofit newsrooms, and it may be closer to 5,000 at this point. In any case, it's one of the biggest collective groups of journalists, and they're all doing original reporting. So it's become a really significant part of the whole ecosystem.
And of course, that's happening in an environment when the number of newsrooms and the number of journalists in those newsrooms is shrinking nationwide. So why do you think the nonprofit sector has gone the opposite way?
I think there are a lot of different reasons. I do think that being nonprofit in news is, some people say, oh, it's just a tax status and it doesn't really matter. I don't think that's true, actually. I don't think the tax status matters much, but what it reflects, the relationship between the press and the public, between the newsroom and the community it serves, is fundamentally different. It's saying we belong to you, we're part of this, we're part of your community in the case of local news, and everything we produce belongs to you and we're here to benefit you. And that's a very profound difference. So I think the nonprofits are growing for a few different reasons, but that relationship is at the heart of it. They go to the community and say, okay, what are we going to do about this news situation together? And that fundamentally reframes things. And communities are stepping up to support them. The second thing is that, there was this trending kind of tech tagline for a long time that innovation happens at the edges. And that was a big buzz phrase a few years ago. But the reality is it's true. At the edges, people have more room. Things aren't working in big institutions, so they'll take greater risks. Something doesn't work, they're much more able to scrap it. There's no corporate to check with. They're much more nimble. And so they just try different things, and different things work in different communities. And then I think the third big reason, and you've seen it there in Colorado, is this sense of collaboration and sense of working together to kind of experiment and try something new. You see that in some states and in some cities. Chicago's another, North Carolina. There's now more than 60 nonprofits here where I am in California, and they're more and more working together and forming networks. And again, the structure of nonprofits just makes that a little easier, and it's part of the culture. And so I think those three things set them up for success in this kind of wild time.
And, from what you've seen of these startups, I imagine they run the gamut from refugees from legacy media to people with no journalism background who just see a need and want to start filling it. What do you see in terms of founders?
Yeah, that has evolved. Back when I started with INN in 2015, and I'd been a little bit involved with them prior to that, even though I was still at the AP, almost all of the founders were journalists, and almost all, had come out of legacy media. If they were in any media, it was legacy in one form or another. And I think all of them brought an interest in creating something new to it. Today, it's a little more of a mix. I suspect the majority are still journalists, but many more are younger. This might be the first thing. They want to create something. When they come out of school, they're not aiming to work for the BBC or CNN. There is a really high interest. With Scripps, we created a rural reporting fellowship, and they were overwhelmed with applicants for it. And people are interested in local news and community building and so forth. So it's much more of a generational mix. It's much more diverse in every way: gender, race, income, you name it. And there also are a lot more non-journalists. INN runs sessions for startups every couple of weeks. I still volunteer on those with Courtney Lewis, who runs the INN growth programs. And frequently there are people on that who are business people, civic leaders, somebody just saying, all right, we lost our newspaper, or they pulled the last journalist out of our community. What do we do? And sometimes they're calling to say, how do we hire a journalist, or how do we frame this up? How do we create, conflict of interest policies? Just very basic things. So the interest is broadening in that. I will say, one of the things when I started at INN, I had come from AP, and I had a very typical bias, I think, at the time in news media and technology, which was that scale was the marker of success. Like, you had to reach a certain kind of scale. And I really learned I was wrong on that. We see small outfits do very well, And there also was a feeling at the time, oh, these poor journalists, how are they going to learn to be business people? This is a detriment that they have to overcome this. And there's a great book by a journalist named David Epstein called Range. And he talks about how people are very successful in complex or experimental fields if they have done many different things. And I've actually come to believe that journalists are incredibly well equipped to create experimental new businesses because they will go out and find the information. They don't assume they know everything. They assume they don't. They'll go seek help, figure it out, put it together. If it doesn't work, okay, it's like on to the next story. And I actually think they're the combination of skills for those who choose to take an entrepreneurial path, it fits pretty well.
Interesting. I hadn't heard it put quite that way, but I would agree. And I'm curious if you've seen an evolution in the way community institutions have related to these nonprofit newsrooms. I think, if you had a Metro Daily, you probably had a love-hate relationship with them and kind of took them for granted. But as that's changed, are you seeing, community foundations and even chambers of commerce step into the void and say, we need to solve this. How can we help? Who can we fund? That sort of thing.
Yeah, I think so. Although I'd put a big asterisk with that. I think love, hate, whether it's a big newspaper or a small, scrappy startup, there's always going to be a bit of we need you, but we wish you hadn't reported that, and that's probably healthy. So I do see, it's interesting. There was a gathering in New York City a few years ago of just journalists, all kinds of people worried about loss of local coverage in New York City. There's, of course, all kinds of national and global media based there, but they were losing coverage of the boroughs, the local courts, and so forth. That gathering was one of the catalysts that led to foundation of The City, which covers New York City itself, and some other good local efforts. But the journalists there were shocked that local elected officials and government officials were showing up at that meeting with great, deep concern about the lack of local coverage. We've now gotten used to this because they realize what happens. And also, when you look at the annual Newsmatch campaign, which puts up a national match to match local donations to news, small businesses are big players in those local donations. So business and local government officials realize the communities need coverage. And we do. I heard from a city manager where a local newspaper is going to close down. And he said, I can't be part of the board. I mean, I'm part of local government, but somebody, who can I talk to who can help us save something? And he was looking for people in the community foundation. So I think that local powers that be do recognize the need for news, and they see that kind of community weaving aspect of it. That said, I think any news outlet has to be prepared that some of their supporters are going to be annoyed if a story hits too close to home, or local funders often are successful people that are very tied into an established power base. And I do think it is harder for outlets outside established local power bases to raise local funding from organized local philanthropy, whether that's community foundations or big family foundations that are well established. They need a longer runway. It takes longer. They may be serving communities that are less affluent and will support them, but it just takes some added time and thinking, and I think everyone's still trying to figure out how those pieces fit together. Community foundations, I think, can play a great role, and I hope they play a bigger role. As a journalist, I've seen them do great good, and the Miami Foundation handles, a great deal of money going to journalism from Night and others, for example. But we've also seen community foundations want to have a say in the coverage or be uneasy with more investigative coverage. So I think it varies place to place, and that that's going to take an evolution. in how they think about ensuring there is news, but ensuring it stays independent.
Yeah, and I think that very issue will become increasingly important if Press Forward is wildly successful. How do you recommend that publishers or development people who are engaging these community foundations and other local funders broach that topic? I think a lot of us would go into that conversation just assuming the best and don't even bring it up. What's your recommendation there?
Yeah, I think they do need to bring it up early and in a non-hostile way. I mean, I think the worst thing a journalist can do, and I've seen this happen, is whether they're an official community foundation or anyone, they call and say, hey, I have a story. I'm a donor. I just heard of something that is a story I think you guys should cover. The journalist may think, oh, you're a donor. You're trying to sway our coverage. Often they're not. They just heard of a story that's a good story. And so you have to create those structures so they have someone to call who isn't the frontline journalist in the newsroom. And the same about having that discussion with family foundations or community foundations. Most people have language in their grant agreement that says we don't influence what stories are chosen to be covered. But it's worth having a friendly discussion about that, saying you value it because it's an independent look at something. And that's the very reason that people will come and check what is real here. So help us preserve that independence. And here's the language we use. What do you think of that? What's your worst case scenario? What if you think we made a big mistake? Here's how we'd suggest. Here's who you could call. Here's how we suggest we deal with it. But having that conversation up front before they get going, before they sign a grant agreement or anything is a really good idea because, one, it builds trust. You're talking about it openly. Let's put it on the table. How do we work through this? And that in itself builds trust. And then later, inevitably, there will be a story that makes a mistake or a story that doesn't make a mistake but exposes wrongdoing or something that just maybe it isn't wrongdoing, but it just wasn't the smartest thing. It's holding public officials to account. It gets really uncomfortable. You can come back to that conversation and say, okay, we all sat down and talked about this. So let's kind of go back to our notes and think through this and keep a professional relationship, but keep the independence in coverage. And usually I think that works for people, but there are some times I do think it's important for all news outlets to have enough different sources of revenue that they can walk away from any source of revenue that seeks undue influence or who wants to suddenly come off the board because something was written about their company. They have to have that ability to walk away. And that's the other big reason for revenue diversity, right, aside from being sustainable.
You mentioned earlier communities that maybe don't have the resources. And I'm curious what you're seeing, recently in terms of trends on diversity and coverage of undercovered community, whether that's rural or economically disadvantaged or communities of color. What have you seen in terms of trends, and what's your hope as Press Forward gets going that the impact of this new round of new initiative of focus on funding will spur?
A good set of questions there. Let me unpack those kind of a bit at a time. I do think the reason local is under such strain is that they don't have any scale. The smaller the community, the fewer companies, people, individuals there are to support news. And we're in this cultural shift where people have thought for generations news should just be there. It should be free. And most people still think that, right? But the economics of that don't really work. So I think communities have to figure out what news do we most need? How can we afford it? How are we going to fund that? And the combination is a little different in every community. Some have robust retail advertising that flows through underwriting and sponsorships to nonprofits as well as for-profits. Others do not. In rural areas, the challenge is distribution. how does somebody get that news? And they can go to a website and find it, but it's hard to really broadcast it out to people. So the challenges vary, but we are seeing people come up with really creative solutions. First of all, in communities that aren't very well covered, often they were never very well covered by mainstream media either. Like, we all know, it may seem like a newspaper that had hundreds and hundreds of reporters, oh, well, they should cover every community, but that was spread across sports and every section of a newspaper and all those production jobs. They never really got down to neighborhood levels in most metro areas, I would say. So there's always been communities that haven't been covered. And because affluent communities have been most valuable to advertisers, those generally were covered. And less affluent communities are less out of the mainstream, however, by age, race, income, any number of reasons, were not. And so in those communities, when people have media that's serving them, they are really clicking in, and there's a high degree of engagement around it. You see that with MLK 50 and Memphis. You see it all over the country with local outlets that are serving a community that has just felt like it didn't really have its news source. So they are able to find means to do it. I think the key in the long run will be seeing, can they find enough diverse sources of revenue that are practical in these small communities? So typically, even a quite small newsroom will have 3 or 4. They have individual donations. They have some organized philanthropy, local or state or national, more local and state for local outlets. And they do tend to have advertising and sponsorship. And then some of them hold events and sell tickets or have a variety of other revenue sources. So if they have 3 or 4, they're in, they have a stable base with several legs holding it up. What you are starting to see is you're seeing a lot of networking, INN, Lion, there are other networks. You have a big one in Colorado. And now it's happening locally. Resolve Philly has a whole network of news outlets working together. Massachusetts has just been on fire with startups, in part because they're replacing Gannett, as Gannett has pulled back so drastically. And they are starting to work together. They'll call INN, they'll get together, but they're also, well, do you have an accountant? Oh, okay, we need them half the time. So you're seeing these networks form, right? And that makes smaller communities able to retain or keep a news outlet. So I think we're still in the early days of that, and that's forming up, and that is going to happen.
What are you seeing particularly, now as the biggest challenges that are facing nonprofit newsrooms that are unique to nonprofits? I mean, everybody's struggling with sustainability and, many of the same problems. What is unique to nonprofits that anybody starting one or supporting them needs to be aware of?
I think the challenge for nonprofits is also tied to their strengths, and that is they do need to invest up front in those connections to the community. They need to build a board. The board in a nonprofit is not just a technicality. It's really the connection to the community. It's evangelists, fundraisers, a brain trust, someone to be accountable to, who's accountable to the community. And so building strong boards and getting people to serve on those is a challenge all startups face, but it's particular for nonprofits. Those that have a strong board and retain a strong board do well, and they're able to grow, and they're able to build broad community support. The other big challenge for nonprofits, it's maybe just a different flavor of what for-profits face as well. For-profits, have been free based on advertising or the attention of the audience. And that has been disrupted by technology, I think, globally and irreversibly. So they have that problem. In the nonprofit world, a different flavor of that is just that none of us are used to paying for news. And so that's a cultural shift. If you want this, just like if you want the high school sports teams, you're probably going to buy that candy from the booster club, or these things. If you want in your communities and you want to live a certain way, you're going to think about how to actively support it. We're not used to thinking of news that way. So that's a big cultural shift. And that's what I'm hopeful. I am hopeful about Press Forward, in that talking about it and getting the word out to a much broader range of people, I think can help with that cultural shift, because it is a big cultural shift and it's global. And while it seems like going from 100 to 500 newsrooms is fast, it's not as fast as the commercial models going off a cliff. And so there is a sense of urgency. There is a sense of much more to do. The other challenge that's implicit in all that is that I think Pew has done studies. Most Americans assume nonprofits and charity and philanthropy is a big part of American life. It's like, was it 1 in every 10 jobs? Is it a nonprofit? It's a huge part of our economy and our life. But most people don't understand how it works. And so there can be this assumption, there are some big magical foundations out there, Knight Foundation, but they're just going to cover everything in our local community. And that's not realistic. It is going to be up to local communities to support local news, ultimately. So I think the key is look at Press Forward, look at big philanthropy as seed funding, as something that enables the innovation, that convinces the community to step up and support. I think it needs that leverage. That's one of the reasons I remain very bullish about Newsmatch, which is that national matching program, because the success of Newsmatch is not the national funds. The success is how many local dollars does it incentivize? And that's the end game. That's what we all have to do. And I hope Press Forward works the same way. I think if people sit back and think, Press Forward's going to solve all the economic issues and we'll have local news, I think that would be an unfair expectation. I think it's another strategic lever to figure out how do we talk to our communities about local news.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's a real concern in terms of how people understand the role of the particularly the large institutional funders. I was in conversation with one of the entities involved in Press Forward, and we asked her, what keeps you up at night? What's your biggest concern about Press Forward? And she said the Mackenzie Scott effect, that when people hear about a large donation or when they hear about Press Forward, they think, it's taken care of. I don't need to, pay my $20 donation, for my membership or whatever.
Yeah, that's why I think it has to be used very strategically to lift that local funding. The other thing I will say, we talked about the challenges of being a nonprofit. One of the assets that's going along in these mix of things that's making the field grow is that line between what is local and what is national coverage. Those of us who've been journalists for a long time, that's crystal clear. It's like these segments of the industry is no longer crystal clear, and I think that's actually a very good thing. When you look at local news, it is, of course, vitally important locally. But the other thing is national news really should be and used to be much more informed by local news. It trickled up through Gannett, through radio network, through NPR, through AP, through all these things, and informed the national conversation. And now they've been kind of bifurcated. So there still is this huge local role, but there also, you are seeing networks form like the Rural News Network, where they're all covering rural issues, and then they all of a sudden connect all those dots and raise a big national story, whether it's a trend story or breaking news. When you look at national news of our border issues and immigration, national news tends to be very politicized, not in the news reports themselves, but it's reflecting statements of this politicized debate. But then if you look at local coverage of the border and immigration, there are now scores of small newsrooms covering immigrant communities and the actual geographic border region. And they have nuance, and they're going into in-depth and different angles. And so collectively, you get a much fuller picture. And I think right now that still tends to not necessarily bubble up to national news, but I think it's starting to more and more. So I think you'll see that play a bigger role.
You mentioned paying for news, and I'm curious whether INN had a strong stance about paywalls. A lot of newsrooms have moved to that, but we've also seen a lot of examples, an increasing number of examples of for-profit and nonprofit not putting a paywall up, but saying, hey, if you want to support this, pitch in.
It wasn't a strong... There is a philosophical basis, and then there's a pragmatic. Philosophically, and this is more me, it's not an official INN position, but nonprofits do exist on money that is taken out of the tax base. I think that matters. I think it compels you to be more transparent, to tell the public how you're spending that money, and to ensure the public good, to make sure that news is available to people who maybe cannot pay for it or can't easily pay for it. So that's the philosophical basis of, if you can make this news available for free, that's really serving democratic needs, it's serving civic needs, it's serving public good needs. So philosophically, I'd rather see the news free, but I think there are places, Black Club Chicago charges in communities that are affluent and not in communities that aren't, and makes it all work together. I think that's fine. Pragmatically, I think, as you said, people keep trying paywalls and then they back off of it. I subscribe to a lot of paid things, and I can, but that's kind of my business to subscribe to good news media. So people can, but I think overall you are seeing a generational shift. There have only been a few studies, but people have found that younger Americans are more likely to donate for media and news and less likely to subscribe to it, whereas older Americans are more likely to subscribe. So I think we need to watch that and see what happens and where that evolves just on a pragmatic basis. I think in many communities, the messaging is clearer. We're here as part of the community. We're here as an asset. So we're not going to lock you out if you can't pay for it, but please support it. And that messaging is working. You're seeing donations go up. You're seeing the scale of the industry go up. As long as that's working, and if there is this generational shift, I think you are going to see more open news.
Yeah. And early on in this conversation, you talked about how nonprofit it's really more than just a tax status. But I've also seen an evolution in how nonprofit newsrooms and support groups and funders think about their role in the ecosystem. And I think there used to be some unnecessary tension. And I think right now there's the sense that we need all comers. We need a big tent because the needs are so drastic. And certainly we should all, I think, come to this with a public service mindset.
Keep in mind, my stats may be slightly out of date, but I don't think they've moved that far. In average, the average nonprofit newsroom is giving away its news, providing its news reporting to 20 other news media. A great majority of those are for-profit. So there's no us versus them. As resources become more constrained, naturally you do get in those tensions of us versus them. But I would agree with you. I think they're unfortunate. The public's not looking at it. We're in an urgent situation of ensuring there's more news out there, however we do it.
And I want to head into talking about converting from a for-profit to a nonprofit. For-profits are still a vital part of the ecosystem, and particularly in smaller communities where you might have a family-owned newspaper. That's just part of the culture there. And communities of color, I think ownership can often be particularly important. So I just want to acknowledge that. But if you are a newsroom who's thinking about moving to for-profit, what do you, first of all, why do you think newsrooms might want to consider that? Or why do they think about that conversion?
Yeah, I think there are a number looking at that conversion, and almost all of them are family-owned or someone who's been really, really dedicated to their community. The biggest reason I hear from talking to family-owned papers that are looking at converting, the biggest reason is they are family-owned and there's no obvious successor. And that goes hand in hand with it isn't really a profit-making business anymore at the local level. So if somebody wants to create generational wealth, have a family business, I completely get that. That makes all the sense in the world, except I'm not sure it will going forward. And you're seeing that, and that's why families who are deeply dedicated, who are absolutely public service minded, who could have made much greater wealth doing any of 2,000 other things, are still doing it. But as they look forward, is it better to have something owned by the community? Or they do tend to get offers, but they tend to be from out-of-state investment houses that they don't sense have a commitment to the community or keeping any funds they pull out in the community. So I think those are the biggest reasons you're seeing the shift. And then as people look, they just see that the model is shifting and this may be more sustainable. I think it would look different if we were all looking out and saying, oh, if you just hang on 5 years, this is going to change and then this will be a break-even business again. But unfortunately, I don't know anybody looking out and seeing that.
I know some newsrooms think about the conversion in part so they can have an easier time of getting philanthropic funding. Is that, what kind of expectation would you set for those who are thinking this is?
There's a lot of that happening, and many have gotten project funding. Some of that I think has been okay, and some of it, I've gone on those sites and there's no accounting to the community. We were asked at INN to take part in a state fundraising campaign at the end of the year and combine it with Newsmatch, but it's a state with a number of for-profit papers owned out of state. And we said, okay, will you commit to keeping any of the dollars you raise in the state? And they wouldn't. And we said no. So I see good behavior and bad behavior. And I think it just takes being transparent with the community, ensuring that if something's made with donor dollars, that stays in the community. It can't be sold along with the rest of the paper. It's given to the local library or something of that sort. If the for-profit company is sold later, that there's some return of charitable funds to foundations or the other entities in the community that can put it to charitable use. So I think there's ways to do it, and it's just that people should think through those ways to do it. Again, ultimately, it's for the good of the community and that public service role.
I know one obstacle that some particularly family-owned businesses might have, they're worried about giving up control. And even I was talking with a founder who left a corporate chain. And it's like, look, I left there because I didn't want people on my have their thumb on me. So how do you address that particular issue?
That is a really fair question. I think you do lose control. You give up control in a nonprofit model, and your board serves as that control for the community. So I always said, I was CEO and executive director of INN, but I worked for the board. The board in a nonprofit is as close to an owner as you come. And even if you're the CEO, your staff. That's a really hard transition for somebody who's run a family-owned business. But the reality is most CEOs or founders or owners are picking at least their initial board. And then you write bylaws and you create a structure that ensures the kind of organization you want to see go forward. So I think owners have tremendous power to design the future of their news outlet with the community. They can't do it, just go in a room and write exactly what they want it to be. They can, but that makes it harder to build that community support. So I think they need to do it with the community, but they probably have the greatest influence on determining where it goes. So I don't think they're powerless at all to do that. The other thing that comes up that I hear a lot is for-profits can endorse political candidates. And in many communities, that's been an incredibly valuable role. Whether you agree with the endorsements or hate them, you might vote with them or against them, but it is somebody sitting down and looking at these issues that the rest of us just stick our head in the sand for at least 8 months of the year, and then suddenly, oh God, I got to vote in a month, I'm going to do this. And so that's been valuable. Nonprofits cannot endorse political candidates. And again, it's for good reason. They serve a different purpose. They're publicly funded in a different way. So some newspapers in particular, I don't think that's been as big a deal for broadcasters, but newspapers have been reluctant to give that up. That said, I think this, like many other things, is part of a larger sweeping change. And that we're now seeing dozens and dozens and dozens and dozens of nonprofit newsrooms produce election guides and hold election candidate forums and be the center of election information without endorsing. And often people say, no, I actually trust them because you don't endorse. You're telling me about them and leaving the decision to me. So I think that is an evolution in maybe public expectations or how the public assigns trust in election information, and we'll see where that goes. But that's the other hurdle I hear of. And then the third is just, what do I do with these assets? I've got a building. The heartbreaking, hardest part I hear is that often these are family businesses. They have longtime employees. The guy who runs the press, a layout person, and they're trying to save their jobs. And ultimately, they may not be able to because the product is changing, what the community wants is changing. And those are coming from the heart and the right place, but are really hard decisions. And so they can often save the paper, but it's not going to look like it did or be produced like it was 10 years ago even.
Yeah. The other thing I've heard, and I heard this more pre-Salt Lake City Tribune conversion, was how does advertising fit in this? And I think this is an evolving picture and even lacks some clarity from the IRS, but how is advertising treated? And do you have to worry about the percentage of advertising and all of that?
You do. For startups, I think this is a harder issue for conversions. And actually, I don't think it's entirely clear. Salt Lake got and shared very good legal advice around it, and other people are looking at this. But it also, some advertising is transactional, right? A coupon, right? It's just transactional, it's business. But some is more sponsorship underwriting where you're affiliating brand, but it's not, it's more of a charitable endeavor aligning with this thing. So that's a point of development, I would say, and there isn't perfect clarity from the IRS about it. What I generally tell startups is don't worry about it. First, you're going to pay taxes. If you make money and clear a profit on some ad sales, pay taxes on it. What a great problem to have, When it gets up to a big portion of their operation or a big portion of their income, that's where it becomes trickier. And Salt Lake was in that situation. And so you do have to get legal advice and look at it and look at, there have been a lot of tangential kind of IRS findings that you can kind of piece together, and people do that. But it's very particular to the circumstances, the share of the business coming from that, the share of the business effort attached to it. And so it is a bigger issue for conversions.
And then just last question on conversions. I assume that if someone is considering this, they should go to INN, and there are resources and trainings and that sort of thing to help them get started?
There is a conversion guide on INN under resources. It is due for an update, but it's still a wealth of good information. And then there are other resources out there, Lawyers for Reporters, which is a pro bono legal referral service. They help with conversions. So do many private attorneys or some at Davis Wright Tremaine. There are ones who work in the documentary industry, which has both nonprofit and for-profits products, sometimes within the same company, that can help with it. And the Trust Law, which is run and funded by the Thompson Foundation of Thomson Reuters origin, also provides some pro bono guidance.
And so now I want to step back a little and maybe truer exit interview fashion. Just talk about your career trajectory and your experience at INN in particular, and going from the AP, very large organization with a lot of resources, to jumping in at INN and seeing that grow. How did you change as a leader, and what were some of your biggest learning, highlights?
It definitely was a huge switch in many regards in just the scale of the dollars. And from AP is looking at things globally, systemically, and has a lot of different businesses supporting its news gathering. The similarity, though, is also there, and that AP is overwhelmingly a mission-driven organization. I think everybody who works there shares that, and it's the journalists at AP take enormous risks and endure a lot of danger and are dedicated in a way that is rather extraordinary. When you shift to these nonprofit startups, they're not necessarily going into war zones or taking the risks in that way, but they are risking their family's livelihood. They're risking a lot because the depth of their commitment to producing journalism. So that is akin. And the fun of INN, which was enormous, is if you're only working with people who are working on their passion projects, I mean, that's enormously exciting. Like nobody's kind of saying, oh God, I have to do this for another Wednesday and I'm in my cubicle and I'm not sure I'm doing it. I mean, they're just bubbling with ideas, or sometimes it's anger and frustration, but still they're bubbling with this passion for it. And that was really fun. I think the biggest switch for me was going from, I do have a systems focus, and I think in networks, and it really tried to leverage INN as a network to build this growth. So that part was still there. But to be perfectly honest, in the early days when I was talking to these startups, I talked to them and it's just one person or two people, and I think, oh my God, there's no way they could make it. And many of those, I will tell you that I just thought, I didn't say it to them, of course, but I just thought after I'd hang up the phone, like, oh, I just don't see how they're going to make it. Many of those are thriving today. So you learn some humility in your own judgment. And that's where I learned to value the experimentation, and that it wasn't clear. Okay. And funders immediately and still ask, well, what's replicable? Do you see the patterns? Is it replicable? You see the replicable pattern that they are oriented and deeply woven into what the community actually wants and needs. That's the only common denominator. We're just starting to see common patterns in how they make money, how they partner, but it's still very early. So those patterns will emerge over the next 10 years or so, but they're still very early, and there's still a lot more experimentation than replicating something from one community to another. So it took me a while to figure that out, and I had to come to a point of, I'd say there were two things in leadership, three. One is we had to build a more varied team, as this field was just exploding in the size of it, and there were only three of us on the core team initially. So INN had to grow and support thousands of more people in this network and add that. And we, even before COVID, we were all remote because the people who joined INN if we were able to hire them wherever they were at and they had the skills, we were just able to put together a phenomenal team, and they're still phenomenal. And so that was a huge plus. Building that varied team. The second was realizing the industry was growing into segments. So ProPublica, Mother Jones, Grist, these big players are really critical to the whole ecosystem. They share knowledge, they partner, they create sub-networks, but they have a whole different set of economics, abilities. Their product is wildly different. Their distribution's wildly different. Then you have local startups, that's the whole thing. And then statewide news has some unique characteristics as well. So I think the balancing act at INN and in leadership was, okay, we're making hard choices every year. What do we do that'll move the needle the most for the most people? And be critical. And so I think every year, and I'm sure this continues, there's things there's 200 things you want to do, and you really pick 20 or 12 and do them, and those others stay out there, and then you get to them. And then the final thing was you're making those choices where you think you'll make the most difference, and you're very honest with people about what you think will work and doesn't work, or what you're seeing will work and not work. But I think one of the reasons the field has grown is that we did suspend judgment. We said, okay, if you want to try that, we will support you as best we can. And that's where those unexpected successes and wins come up, that people discover something new that works where they are.
Yeah. And just as a quick aside, you mentioned newsrooms that survived that maybe you didn't expect to. In my research, I found where I think you said 94% of your members that's a survival rate, which is phenomenal for any startup, particularly in this industry, I would think.
And that's when I first came, the first time we ran those numbers, I thought, oh, this just can't be right, because the rule of thumb for startups is 50% survive. And I actually dug into it. And for nonprofits, it's something like maybe 70 or 80% are still, you don't have as a definitive a closure, but they're still providing services. They're still doing what they do. So I always thought, okay, this will go down. And it did go down over the years. It went from 4% to 6% that we found closed, but it's still phenomenally high. I do think they're very resilient. I think that community base of support is extraordinary, and that they, as the field gets bigger, there may be more closures, but I don't know. I mean, we've been watching that again now for almost 10 years, and they're not all easy years. I mean, it's been bull markets more than bear markets, but still the growth is pretty significant. So I am hopeful it's a model that's finding its place.
And, I want to ask about your advice for people in my position and around the country, all the way up to the national foundations. There's a lot of conversation, certainly since I started the Press Association, that around shared services, that we can't have all of these duplicative efforts on all these small organizations where they're stretched so thin. And so with Press Forward and a lot of other initiatives, there's just been increasing focus on support organizations. And so as someone who led a very successful one, what advice would you give to us in the support organizations on how to make sure we're doing what we need to be doing to give that support?
I think that's fair. I think there's two things. I do think shared resources matter, but I think it's a mistake if they are the primary focus for funders or for anyone, because there are more and more, this is where technology can help. There are more and more off-the-shelf services, right? You can use JustWorks instead of hiring a payroll processor and a benefits person and a good deal of your accounting. So there are really efficient ways for much smaller organizations to operate than was true a decade ago. So you want to make sure the shared services are something that these organizations really want and have to be beyond what's out there for other small businesses. Journalists, like anybody, always think, oh, we're unique. Well, your payroll isn't, honestly, really. So you really have to think about what's unique and what needs to be unique to news and what is just out there. And then I think the support organizations, to some extent, are the facilitators of saying, yeah, we vetted these 8 CRM systems, or let us collect what our members use them, and here's how they rank them, and you're the facilitator for helping people find the right fit, rather than building something yourself. So it takes that constant calibration, I think. The other thing I'd say about shared services, I do think they're very important. They can save a significant percentage that matters for all type of news organizations, but they can't be the key focus because they're never going to save enough. The key focus has to be generating enough support to support original reporting. You can have an Axios, you can have all kinds of organizations that are packaging, rebundling news, but unless you can generate the revenue to do the original reporting, none of that all kind of falls away. So I still think that the even shared services need to be focused on that cultural shift and that discussion of how do we fund original, trusted, fact-based reporting.
And so then the final segment, rapid fire questions, and my questions will be quick, but your answers don't have to be.
Okay.
So first question is, compared to a year ago, are you more or less optimistic about the future of local news?
Oh, I am more optimistic about it, much more. One, I've seen continued growth. I still spend half my week talking to startups and people trying to figure out their strategies because I love doing it and working with them. And there's more and more. I actually think AI, I don't know if it's a silver lining. I mean, I just think we're going to be plagued with these tsunamis of crap and algorithmically generated, I don't even want to say information, stuff. And I do think you are seeing people go back to, do I know this journalist? Can I go to a meeting? Can I see a live interview? Can I engage? And so I think local news, where people know their local newsroom, is probably going to be seen as more important rather than less.
So you may have tipped your hand on the answer to this next one, but does AI fill you with more hope or dread when it comes to journalism?
It's both, and it depends on the day which side of that teeter-totter I would be sitting on. I think the tools can be very useful. I think, look, I was just thinking about this morning because I was thinking about which is creepier, the Apple ads smashing all of the instruments of creation, or Google saying, leave the Googling to us, which is terrifying because search already narrows what you see in a way that is causing global disparities and really horrible social impacts. Unintended, not their intent. But if you combine that yet more and you're turning over your judgment and what you know entirely to an algorithm controlled by a private company, I think that's very dangerous for not just journalism, but democracy, global peace, go from there. So that aspect of AI, I think if it is regulated, I think if people learn that human judgment is different than algorithmic judgment, driven by commercial needs, it could be okay. But I think we're in a dangerous in-between period here.
Messy desk or clean desk?
Oh, messy. Very messy.
Do you have a favorite failure? We like to talk about, and particularly on the West Coast where you are, up in Silicon Valley, fail fast. Failure's not a bad thing, but we don't talk about it very much, particularly in journalism.
Oh, failures. I mean, if I go back to being a reporter, I certainly made mistakes in doing that. I think, not to repeat too much, but I do think my early faith of this will all be clear quickly and that there's a system, and if we just detect it, thinking that growth happened that way really was a mistake. And had I valued experimentation properly to begin with. I think we could have done more to encourage more of it and been a louder voice with funders encouraging it as well.
This is a very difficult field. Nonprofits can be very difficult. Running a support organization can be challenging. Do you have a favorite place or thing you like to do to just restore yourself and maintain your sanity?
Yeah, I get outside, I garden in the yard, and then I hike a lot. And that kind of balances out sitting and looking at the screen, which I still do way too much. So I think journalism, for photographers and videographers, it's a very physical job, but for most of us at a keyboard, it's not. So doing something tangible, building something tangible, volunteering in a tangible way that you're not in your head and you're not on your computer is really important. And I have this discussion a lot with people who founded everything from PBS shows to nonprofits to newspapers. I do think you always have to be conscious that people in the future aren't going to do things the way you did or that you did in the past. And I think that's truer now than ever. I'm not saying I always did this perfectly, so it might be more advice than what I was able to do. But I do think being open and being more of a coach than a director in times of rapid change is more important than ever. It's not the least bit helpful to tell somebody how you did something 15 years ago and why that was a win or this was a fail, because the context has changed enough. But if you can hear them out and say, have you thought about it this way? Could you approach it that way? Or what seems the biggest problem or the path forward? Then your experience can have huge value, but it's not a let me tell you what I did kind of leadership. It just won't work in this time.
So you alluded to still taking calls, and I know you're still doing some consulting. So I don't know if you consider yourself really in retirement, but what's the thing you most looking forward to doing?
The thing that I'm most enjoying already is just more flexibility. I do spend less time at the keyboard. I'm doing a lot more traveling. I'm about to head to Korea for 3 weeks, and I have more flexibility to do that, and I really love that because I've worked a lot of hours for a whole lot of years. And so it's that flexibility of time and being able to explore things that interest you, the balance of that, what interests you versus, when I have to get done by Thursday at 5, that kind of thing is great. But it is, for me, I expect to keep working a long time in various ways. I don't know that I'll go back to full time or something. It's more of a sabbatical, and then being able to consult. And I do a lot of pro bono stuff with people who I really admire what they're trying to do in journalism and figure it out, because I do feel that sense of urgency, and I feel the field's going to keep growing. So that's enormously fun for me. And I like journalists. So that line between is it vacation or working with journalists, for me, that's pretty blurred.
So for someone who's visiting LA maybe for the first time, or they just want to discover something new, what do you recommend people do when they come to LA?
Oh my gosh. LA, I will say, first of all, LA is a better place to live than to visit, because when you live here, you live in a neighborhood and you don't spend hours in traffic and you know where you want to go. So pick an area, and if you're going to travel across town, never, ever, ever do it at rush hour. So you do time to avoid travel, but LA is wonderful. The ocean's great. You could get up in the snow in the mountains. So while it's a huge city, the outdoors are fabulous. It's a creative ferment. I mean, it's just such a center for music and art. People think of the movies, but you don't actually see that production out there as much. But the amount of art produced and young talent and just coming from all parts of the world, it's a great place. And there's pretty good guides. There's a lot of good blogs, and there's a lot of kind of media that are very neighborhood oriented. So I live on the close to downtown LA. There's the East Sider, which is an independent startup really doing well. LA Taco started as a food review site, but now really covers news. LA Public Press, Witness LA, Afro LA. There's, again, like other places, there's all these little interesting startups that give you a slice of the city.
Do you have a favorite hole-in-the-wall restaurant?
Oh my gosh. I mean, if you're coming to LA, you have to eat tacos. They're so good. They're just everything here. I go to Tacos Delta on Sunset Boulevard, a little family-owned hut, and their tacos are fantastic. And that's where I would send people.
Well, thank you for your time, and hope you have a fun time in Korea. Is that what you said?
Yeah. Thanks, Tim.
Thank you for listening to the Local News Matters podcast. Never miss an episode by subscribing in your favorite podcast player and sign up for our newsletter at lnmpod.com. And thanks to our production partners at Pirate Audio. Pirate Audio believes every community deserves great things to listen to, and they're on a mission to help local newsrooms reach their communities via audio. If you're interested in starting a podcast or need production support for an existing one, let me know and I'll be happy to connect you. If you have guest recommendations, others doing interesting and innovative work in local news, let me know through the contact form at the website lnmpod.com.